Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. This is going to be part 2 of my rod bearing DIY on my E90 BMW. Alright guys, I put in the comments of my last video that I'm going to be upgrading my camera. I'm really stoked with this camera. I upgraded to the A7 III and I'm using my new lens, the Sigma Art 24mm f1.4. So with next to no lighting in my garage right now, this looks completely lit and very usable. It's really nice. That's what you get with a full frame camera and a fast lens. So look forward to some better production quality going forward. If you missed the last video, I pulled the rod bearings out on my N54. So these are the rod bearings that we're going to be installing on the car today. These are standard size and there's 2 per pack, made by King. So I might as well show you the rest of the parts that I got to make this all come together. So here are all the bearing shells, of course an oil filter, got some assembly lube, plastic gauge. Here's a guide for the oil pump chain, valve cover gasket. That goes on the tensioner for the oil pump chain. The new sprocket, new bolt for the chain guide, front crank seal, new timing chain, new oil pump chain, new bolts for the Vanos actuator, new OEM rod bolts, new bolts to hold the power steering pump, new plug for the timing chain cover, oil pan bolt kit. This is the oil pump bolt kit. Comes with all new bolts for the windage tray, etc. A new O-ring for the oil pickup tube, a new friction disc for the crank hub, the newer style crank hub, the newer sprocket. That's the new sprocket. That has a newer style friction disc on the front. This came out about a year ago. They made one version and now this is the newest version. It's grippy. You're afraid to put your hand on there. It kind of feels like 1000 grit sandpaper. Part of the timing chain guide. Another part of the timing chain guide. I went OEM with all this stuff. New crank hub bolt, which is one-time use, torque to yield. Of course, we have the oil pan gasket. So this is what's involved if you want to do your timing chains or proactively replace your guides. I've had a number of viewers ask for me to include the cam tray DIY since I'm already in here locking everything, and these would cost me over $1,000. I'd be happy to make the content, but I can't really justify spending that much extra money when I don't necessarily have the problem. I have high mileage, so I should be changing them anyway, but for now I don't want to dump an extra $1,000 into this motor. Some of the early cars, or even the majority of N54s from what I've read, don't have Teflon sealing rings for their camshafts, and they have metal rings that dig into the cam trays, and then you'll get Vanos codes, etc., and you'll have to replace these. So you can't really confuse the upper and the lower. The coating color on them is a little bit different. One is a little bit lighter, one is a little bit more gray, and then you have the tangs on opposite sides. So if you take a look at the rod itself, it calls for the tang on this side, and then the rod cap calls for this tang. Here's the rod cap. That's how you insert it. Make sure it's level on either side. So you want to dry fit these right now with plastic gauge. Brought the piston back down. Okay, so now I got to insert a piece of plastic gauge right here so we can measure the clearance. We're supposed to do this dry, and then we're going to measure the clearance here. We're going to cut a piece, stick it on the rod cap, compress this down, and then remove it and see where we end up in this range. Over here would be very tight, over here would be looser. The idea with these aftermarket bearings is they go for a little more clearance than factory. So the way BMW made this engine, and even like their M engines, they make the clearance very tight. And if you have like an S85 or S65, you want to upgrade to aftermarket bearings that offer more clearance than factory so that you're less likely to encounter wear over time. You get a little bit more of a film area, and that works well with thicker oil like 5W40 anyway. So what I'm going to do here is install these aftermarket bearings, which are not going to be over on the tight side, they're going to be on the looser side, and they average out the difference between all the different color options for the N54. They come in different colors normally. You're supposed to consult your block and see what type of color code your engine calls for. But what I'm doing is installing aftermarket, which naturally goes for a larger clearance regardless of what the color coated bearings that came with your engine are. And that helps when you have high horsepower or whatnot. It just helps in performance applications anyway. A tighter clearance is technically better, but a little bit looser can be better depending on the application, as far as I understand. So normally you wouldn't want to see all the way over to this side because it's like it barely compressed the plastic gauge, but we're actually going to see somewhere in this range if everything's fine over toward here, not so much toward here. Hopefully that's not wider than the journal. So that fits in that area. Getting it to stick with some oil film, matching tang for tang, make sure we're going properly here. Okay, so before anything, take one of the bolts, dip it in some good quality oil. They have to be oiled for torquing. FYI, these are the old rod bolts just for plastic gauging purposes. We're going to torque these to 20 Newton meters. And check to see that these gaps are perfect on either side. Since these are fractured rods, you should see it as if it's one piece again. Now we're going for 70 degrees of tightening. Now we're going to go for another round of 70. That's full tight. That's fully tightened now. Now we're going to release this and take a look at the plastic gauge. So I would set these aside since they're your old bolts. You don't really want to overstretch them more than once or twice. So from the looks of it, we ended up right in the middle at 0.038 mm. Yeah, it looks like right around there. So it's kind of luck of the draw in terms of where you're going to end up with your rod clearance, because as I said, they come in different colors and 3 or 4 different bearing options. So it just so happens when you run these king bearings on my setup here, it's on the tighter side. I've seen it where it's more on the looser side on other people's cars. But that's actually kind of exactly where you'd want to be. Not just saying that, hey, I did something special here, but I kind of got lucky that it's splitting the difference quite nicely. It's right in the middle there. It's where you'd want to be for like perfect clearance. But if you end up over here or here, it's fine as well. Like that's expected because you don't know where you're going to end up depending on what your original bearing color was. But I guess mine puts me right in the middle, kind of exactly where you'd want to be. And I'm not polishing this crankshaft, if you're wondering. This was the worst cylinder technically, but it's like, you know, you can kind of see some slight discoloration, but it's smooth as silk. So there's no point touching this because I didn't have a failed bearing technically. So what I would do is discard those rod bolts now because they've already been stretched twice now and you don't want to reuse them to do the next cylinder. Keep them set aside and go for another set that have only been stretched once. Using some brake clean to clean off the plastic gauge. Now I'll put some assembly lube on there. That way these don't get started up dry. I'll put some assembly lube on this. Make sure you match up the tangs. Grab a rod bolt that's being lubricated, one of your new ones. And while I tighten this down, I should talk about the fact that I went with OEM rod bolts instead of ARP. So to put it out there, ARP rod bolts are an upgrade on the N54 without a doubt, but they weren't specifically made for the N54. They were made for a number of BMWs and they just so happened to fit on this. If you were to use them and tighten them down, they're so aggressive that they could distort the rod end. They could distort the big end, they call this. So this could go out of round either on the rod side or on the cap side, which you'd still want to put them in, but only if you have your engine completely torn apart and it's at a machine shop and you can have them line hone or basically make this back round again after using the ARP bolts. At least that's what I read. So it's not a good idea on this car to do it at home while the engine's still in the car. But yes, ARP rod bolts are an upgrade for the N54, but not when you're doing it at home. because you need to have a machine shop verify roundness. So you'd have to do it with the engine on a stand. They'd be tightening down the connecting rod to the crankshaft, and then they would disassemble after torquing the ARP bolts, which can be reused, and then they would check for round and line hone it. And then after you've line honed it, you can do a final assembly and it will be perfectly round and undistorted. But doing it here at home, I could distort my connecting rod and I'd have a problem. So OEM bolts are recommended when doing it at home. They're good anyway. And the reason you torque to 70 degrees twice is to let the bolts relax a little bit after their first stretch. That's the idea there. So we're going for 20 Newton meters again. Now we're going for 70. So now they've stretched and now they're just kind of going back to their original position because you're giving them a second to chill out. So that's what's recommended when assembling one of these. Let the bolts relax for a second. Now we'll go back for another round of 70. And this feels pretty tough to do. It's taking some effort. I can feel them stretching right now. It almost feels disconcerting because it feels like it's about to snap, but that's normal with torque to yield. If you're used to tightening a good quality bolt and then you are going after these, it feels like you're just about to snap it, but that's just the feeling of the stretch. I feel it right here, right now. After about 50 degrees, it's really stretching. And that's it. That's ready to go, ready for a startup. So I'm going to do that with the remaining cylinders. I'll probably just show you it all. I'll speed up a little bit. I'm going to do the next cylinder, cylinder 3, since it's right in the down position. It'll be easy. And then we'll go after cylinders 5 and cylinders 2, and then 6 and 1. By the way, the piston turns really easily in the bore. So when you're bringing it down, it may feel like it's getting snagged up, but that's just because you got to make sure it's dead straight on the way back down. All right, so there's always a bit of a learning curve with the new camera, but I forgot about the 30-minute recording limit. What I did was I torqued this one down. I checked the clearance with a plastic gauge, and it was identical to this, equally as tight. This is already torqued down with the fresh bolts and oil and assembly lube. We're going to move on to this cylinder now. I'm going to rotate the engine to bring this down enough. So you'll need an angle wrench to be able to do this, either if you get one of those dial indicators or if you want to use a digital torque wrench like I'm using. I'll put a link in the description for the one I'm using here. So that's the third cylinder in a row with the same type of plastic gauge result. It's kind of expected. I'll do them all just to be safe, but it's all about the same 0.038 mm, which is on the tighter side or right in the middle. It's kind of perfect. By the way, assuming you were rotating your crankshaft after tightening the bolts, and if it felt like it was locked up or it wouldn't be able to move, the first thing you'd want to do is read the rod bearing and see if it says STD for standard. It's possible that you could be provided an undersized bearing, and that would be based on you had your crank machined, and this new bearing is supposed to be a little bit tighter to work with the new machining. If they sent you the wrong bearing in the package, then when you tighten things up, it would lock up your crankshaft. It would be like it seized, it wouldn't move, and it would be because you had the wrong bearing. So I've heard of instances where people have gotten non-standard size bearings mixed in with their standard bearings in the box. Just double check that they all say STD if you're doing this at home and you have not had any machine work done to your crankshaft. "62 Newton meters is what that works out to. It tells you what that ended up being in terms of torque. Just about 62 is what it works out to. So that's done. Again, make sure you see the side that everything is dead level and perfect. It'll be like it's one piece again because they're fractured rods. So while I do this next cylinder, I just want to say thank you to all the people that have offered to donate over the years. For the record, I've never taken a penny and I've never taken a sponsorship I've had parts sent to me for free to review it, but I haven't actually taken money. I'm genuinely trying to provide a service for you guys to keep your cars on the road for cheap, and I've pretty much been investing most of the money back into the channel with better equipment or buying parts for the next series, etc. Where I feel slightly guilty or at a bit of a crossroads at this point is with regards to people that want to donate to see more content because they like to see me do jobs I wouldn't do otherwise. So I won't make a habit of this, but if you want to contribute because you felt I've helped you, or you just want to give back, or you want to see me make more content or invest into the channel more with better equipment, then I'm just going to do this one time and we'll see where it goes. But I'll put a link in the description, with the goal being to pay for those cam trays. If that works out, then you're going to have more content coming your way, because while I'm in here I might as well tackle those. So it's rotating really nice and smooth. That's what you want to see. So for anyone that considers it inappropriate to be asking for contributions, hey, I understand. Let me know in the comments. Let me know why. But the motivation was genuinely to see if we could pay for the cam trays in this instance. Just as an observation, the old bolts take more torque to reach the angle than the new ones because they've already been stretched. But again, it's appropriate to use them for plastic gauge purposes. Good to go again. I'd recommend that you guys don't skip this step. Plastic gauge all of them, just in case one of these is ovalized or there's a problem. You may be able to catch it. Just do them all. Making a mess here, but I can't really see because I've got the camera focused in. We're going to change oil right after the first startup to clean all this out. As you saw, we're only at 50 on the first round, and I'm expecting to be around 62 on this round. That shows you that they're stretched properly with these new bolts. Okay, now we'll do cylinder 1 and then we're done with the rod bearing install. Okay, all the rod bolts are tight, and I'm going to rotate in the appropriate direction clockwise and see how it feels. I didn't take the spark plugs out, so I'm getting compression. It feels good. So I'm happy with that. It feels good. Feels like those bearings are perfect for this car. They're not super loose or tight. When you try to move these rods don't move at all. These rods have like next to no movement, as you would expect. You're talking like fractions of a millimeter, which you can't even feel. So that's going to conclude this video. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and change out the timing chains and the guides and all that. That may be the final part of this series, but we'll see. If this is the first video you're catching on mine, please consider subscribing. I do upload regularly. Thanks for watching.